It's tempting to give an answer that answers the questions on the terms of the few people of color that have made it into that space.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Identity politics is among the most contentious terms in recent debates about art. And now, the most powerful people in the United States are blaming just about everything on DEI and wokeness. The very concept of diversity as a positive ideal seems to be under threat. At the same time, so far there's been nowhere near the pushback you would expect. Civil society feels stunned. At least part of this seems to be confusion about what has gone wrong to bring us here, with sections of the population now seeming to reject or just tune out progressive ideas that were all but dominant in mainstream culture just a few short years ago. Maybe backlash was always inevitable, but how do we find a way forward? How do you talk about real criticisms of what may have made the social justice culture of the recent past confusing or alienating without adopting the terms of a truly destructive culture war that is now rising all around us? A few weeks ago, we had on the art critic, Dean Kissick, to talk about his December cover story for Harper's Magazine, which argued that identity politics had, in his words, ruined contemporary art. In my essay for ArtNet responding to him, called Will the Art World Go Post-Woke in 2025, I ended by saying that those looking for a more constructive way forward might read the theorist Olúfẹ Táíwò's book, Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. Táíwò teaches philosophy at Georgetown University and has written pieces for outlets including Foreign Policy, The Nation, and The New Yorker. He's written 2 books of political theory, Reconsidering Reparations and Elite Capture. I've found the concepts that he's developed, which include elite capture, deference politics, and being in the room privilege, very useful in thinking about some of these problems, which are some of the most important problems of the day. So I wanted to bring him on. Femi Táíwò, thanks for coming on The Art Angle.
Thanks for having me.
Where are you calling in from today?
I'm in Washington, D.C.
Right. This is where you teach at Georgetown, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. I teach at Georgetown.
So I have recommended your book, Elite Capture, to people as a useful guide to some of the debates that are unfolding right now. And you are a philosopher. You're not narrowly a philosopher of art or a philosophy of culture, although your work touches on both. But the reason I wanted to talk to you is because identity and identity politics are these huge combustible topics in art right now. And in general, I mean, we're in this very scary, unsettling moment, like attacks on DEI and critical race theory are being used to just smash and grab, really. Just go after government service in general, academia, arts funding, all kinds of things. And at the same time, some of the ways people have talked about identity, the cultural debates of the last 8 years have left, I think, people in disarray. You're just not seeing people like fulsomely defending themselves right now or coming together in a way that you saw maybe 8 years ago when Trump first came into office. And there are these I think real uncertainties about how to navigate talking about some of these issues and some unsettled, really even just confusion about what identity politics is, what it should be, what it can be. So your work touches on all of this in a philosophical and historical way. So to begin with, I just wanted to get your definition of identity politics. You know, where does it come from? What does it mean to you?
So the term identity politics comes from the work of a queer Black feminist socialist collective that met in the Boston area in the 70s called the Combahee River Collective. And what they were describing at the time was a way of thinking about how to do politics. And in particular, I think a way of thinking about where your priorities should come from, politically speaking. So there's this big social system that we're all in, but it affects different people differently. And one of the differences that changes how the system lands for you is what kind of person you are, right? There are certain expectations if you're a woman, certain expectations if you're queer, the list goes on. And so I think the thing that they were advocating for in the manifesto, where the term identity politics comes from, is the idea that you can respond to that in setting what you're going to do politically, responding to the situation that you're in. It doesn't mean you're only going to respond to the problems that show up in your particular individual situation. It doesn't mean that you're going to only work in groups with people that are like you. It just means what confronts you should have a say in thinking about what kind of politics that you want to do. What identity politics has kind of come to mean, I think, both amongst people that would defend it nowadays and maybe the kind of uncharitable readings by people that use it as a term of abuse, is less that kind of targeted point that Combay River Collective was making, and I think more a kind of aesthetic or political style, right? Identity politics is the thing that happens when you talk about identity more than some people are comfortable with or more than some people would expect.
Right. So that's the title of your book, or relates to the title of your book, Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. So just the idea of a takeover means that it was one thing and then it's become something else, or there's a different emphasis as time has gone by. I feel like we should, before going any further, define the other key term here, which is elite capture. Obviously, what interests me a bit about the book is that art is a domain of prestige with a particular relationship to eliteness and status. So the idea of elite capture in thinking about some of the conversations and critiques and debates about identity in art and identity politics of the recent past, it seems like fertile terrain. So where does the term elite capture come from, and how does it relate to this?
So the term elite capture comes from social science, and it's the kind of thing that can be used flexibly. You can read articles from development economists using it to people more in the vein of political science, trying to describe political realities. And the thing that they're often keeping track of in these studies where academics are using this term is distribution, right? So say the World Bank designates some grant for a region, and it's supposed to be divvied up amongst the population. But you notice that a few households have gotten more of those dollars or more of the services than other ones. And it just so happens to be already privileged households, the one that had the majority of the land, the majority of the wealth in that maybe otherwise impoverished region. And so they're using elite to track that compared to the other people in that region. You know, these people have advantages. They might not be Jeff Bezos rich, right? But they have some kind of advantage in getting to this particular resource, the grant from the World Bank, that other families didn't have. And it has to do with advantages that they already had. Wealth advantages, educational advantages, maybe linguistic advantages. Maybe they just speak.
Connections.
Exactly. It's flexible, right? And so that idea of elite capture is just one that I'm applying to identity politics, right? Political style, political language, the invocation of one's demographic identity, anybody can do it, right? You could do it in a prison, or you could do it at Harvard, but the Atlantic is going to write about one of those and not the other, right?
Right. Yes. We are more likely to get read about if these issues unfold in a museum than if they involve in a church basement where people are organizing or something like that.
Exactly.
Is there a particular incident that made you think about elite capture in relationship to identity politics?
Yeah, I mean, there were just a lot of those kinds of conversations where people were having disputes. I was a union organizer back in grad school. I was doing immigration justice organizing outside of campus. It was just coming up in all these organizing contexts where people were having disputes that sometimes involved identity, and some of the uses of identity politics seemed principled to me. Some of them seemed a little opportunistic. And I just found myself trying to sort through what's the wheat and what's the chaff here? Is it worth thinking about politics in terms that uses the language of identity to try to settle questions like who we should listen to in the room? Do we do that while we're bargaining? Do we do that while we're setting up committees? Do we do that while we're discussing what's wrong in our department, in our workplace, right? And what happens if we do? So there are all these practical questions that led to the philosophical research questions underlying them, the stuff that brought me to the Combay River Collective and social science.
So one of the things I think is fascinating about important about your analysis of elite capture, and I think helps to maybe clarify the potential critique of some of these things, or what would make a constructive critique, is that you say it's a system behavior. What do you mean by that? I think that sort of takes it away from the realm of like good intentions. And I think that trips people up sometimes.
There's so many ways to put it that I've tried over the years. Here's what I'll try today. You could imagine, I think, the kind of scenario that people have in mind, right? Someone's trying to get a scholarship, let's say, trying to get from their private high school to a fancy private university, and they play up some aspect of their identity oppression for their admissions letter, kind of bog standard complaint of people who are suspicious about DEI. And the thought might be that that's an instance of the elite capture of identity politics, right? That's a case where somebody who is already privileged, evidenced by the fact that they went to a private high school, is using that to get some extra privilege going to a fancy university. And my point, in a nutshell, is, well, you can complain, and maybe we should complain about what that student is writing in their scholarship essay. But what if we thought about the private school, right? Why is this kid going to private school? All the advantages that they're making use of to do the so-called elite capture are just features of the social environment that we've built in the background of that scholarship application. The fact that there are some schools that people with money can send their kids to that will give them greater opportunities. And none of those things are challenged by complaining about how this kid writes their essay. We would have to actually fix the education system to do that. So there's like a more abstract way in to the fact that elite capture is a system behavior, but I'm starting to prefer just the concrete example like that one. Notice what people are using to do the elite capture. And it's not their lack of virtue. It's the structure of existing inequality.
Right. I do like that in your book, you talk about it through the use of, I don't think it's game theory technically, but the theory of gamification.
Yes.
You can think about game design as producing artificially clear value systems. And then that is a feature of systems that are taking kind of rich themes like identity and sort of simplifying the way we value them. And then I think in some of these cultural conversations, you do have a feeling that like there's been a simplification of the discourse around issues of identity, where it is kind of like the conversation is very like binary, like you're for the importance of representation and therefore the theme of representation is itself good, or you think it's bad and somehow tokenistic, with little room in the middle for kind of some kind of nuanced discussion of what kind of art is hitting in what kind of way, what the specific politics of the artists involved are, and so on. So I like the gamification point.
Yeah, and games, I think, are just such a clear way of saying how structure shapes behavior, right? Why is it that I'm trying to capture the opponent's king? Well, we're playing chess, right? Mm-hmm. Describe any goal beneath that, and it'll eventually end up at trying to capture the opponent's king, right? Because that's how you win. And in the context of actual games, it's very clear how the structure of the game affects play, right? If you make the soccer field twice as long, you're going to have to do more running to score goals, but scoring goals is still the point, right? And winning the game is the point. But we somehow forget that in the social environment. We're perplexed about why the private school kid tells the sob story about their marginalization as if there's something that would explain that behavior except their goal and what structures their goal in a game-like fashion. But that's what explains it.
Right, right. To kind of underline the what I think is maybe the most useful overall point of the book, there's a lot of critique of the discourse or conversation about identity that takes as its point of critique that the problem is with identity. It's talking about identity or identities, people's experiences, which, like you said, should be uncontroversial. Like, that's really what I think we should be trying to preserve, that, like, people's experiences are important. People have different experiences of discrimination, of different histories they bring to the table. That's all rich and rewarding. And then somehow it gets sort of mutated by the rules of the game that we're playing culturally. And one of the things you say is the identity politics gets captured not because there's something wrong with those things, but for the same reason everything gets captured, which is that we live in a very unequal world, which produces these effects where good things get turned into bad versions of themselves. Can you expand that point a little, or did I get that correctly?
Yeah, you got that totally spot on. And just to say a little bit more about it, we could go back to the first example we started with, where the World Bank comes in with a grant for the village, and the wealthiest households or the best culturally connected households in the village end up with more of the grant money than their neighbors, right? It's not that the grant caused out of nothing this resulting inequality, right? What the grant did was present an opportunity to a village of people, and the way that that opportunity landed for the village responded to the inequality that was already there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the inequality that's there already isn't just some one-off past version of the game that has nothing to do with the future. It is the condition that meets any new additions to history, any new changes, any new grants, any new infrastructure projects. Those things are interventions into an ongoing game that was rigged from the beginning. You can complain in the middle all you want, but we're starting from somewhere whenever we try to change anything in politics, whether it's at the level of an individual village or a city or a town or a county, or it's at the level of the world.
There are symptoms of elite capture. So let's talk about, I think, maybe the third concept from your book that I think is really useful to think about some of these issues is deference epistemology or deference politics. And that seems to be one of the symptoms that maybe you saw as being kind of counterproductive to some of the like political conversations that might actually change some of the underlying issues, the kind of issues that people think they're having a conversation around. So what is deference politics?
So if identity politics is a sort of political style or aesthetic, then I think deference politics or deference epistemology is the same kind of thing. Maybe it's within that larger umbrella, right? So if you thought that people's identity, people's demographic background, their race, their religion, their gender, etc., if you thought those things were important and that it was important to make use of those facts about people and respond to those facts about people, that wouldn't settle the question of how. And one way of answering the question of how is deference politics. What I'm going to do about say, women's issues is I'm going to find a woman and I'm going to defer. I'm going to adopt her ideas about what we should do about the problem. I'm going to elevate her voice, pass the mic to her if I'm in a conversation where this comes up. What do I do about Muslim issues? Maybe I'll do the same. I'll find a Muslim, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's an obvious immediate set of complications that comes up and that I think a lot of focus has been on, which is the fact that people can and do inhabit multiple identities and what to do about that. But there's also the more basic problem, which is that that's not a solution to anything, right? In fact, it represents its own set of problems. There are a number of complaints that I have about this, but I'll just review a couple of them. One, it's an abdication of responsibility, right? I think the thing that motivates the person deferring to the woman who might not be a woman is the admirable motivation to respond to the lived experience of being a woman. But that is something that any of us as individuals only has partial access to. And so part of how we get the larger story is by being open and receptive to experiences outside of the ones that we have as individuals, and maybe even outside of the ones any particular in-group has about their own experiences. And the second problem that I have with deference politics or deference epistemology, deference as a way of learning about something, or deference as a way of doing something about a problem that confronts a demographic of people. The other problem I have with it is that it kind of substitutes for what I would think of as a more meaningful engagement with the underlying issue. In your written notes to me, you actually put it in a way that I really like. You said you had been thinking about this idea as deference aesthetics.
Yeah.
Which I think is a really useful way of thinking about it. Because like the imagery of deferring to the right kind of person can be fulfilling in the wrong type of way, right? It can send the social signals that you're doing what it takes to respond to a group's experience, but doing what it takes to respond to a group's experience in a way that matters politically would involve changing the rules of the game, right? Or the setup of the game, rather than the aesthetics of your response to that setup.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky in art and the way people think about it in art, because honestly, art is people's environment. It's the professional environment. It's also like kind of a aspiration in terms of culture is important. It's important to people politically. It's part of their identity, and it's where people are engaged with it for more than a professional reason. They really care about it, believe in it in many cases. So there's like, in the last 10 years in particularly, when there's been a lot of conversation about reconsidering the canon, who gets to speak and so on, there's been a lot of focus on diversifying the space of art, which I think is uncontroversially good, or should be. But then there's a little bit of a level confusion between, like what that means politically. Is that good on its own? It is good on its own, but sometimes it's also, because these are privileged spaces, it's also kind of like it's part, to me it seems like a wider deflection in the political conversation away from certain kinds of political interventions that might take place outside of elite institutions and towards a conversation that kind of turns in on elite conversations. I've actually just seen that in political movements, like how I feel like they get more cultural the further along they go, as there's a kind of elite capture by the people who have the most connections. And that becomes, for a variety of reasons, the easiest problems to solve are like the cultural ones in certain cases. I mean, maybe we need one more term from your book, which is your idea of being in the room privilege, which to me resonates with how the cultural conversation and prestige spaces might have some kind of limits that are worth thinking about as the starting point of a conversation about this.
Yeah, and I think that way of setting it up, I think, tees it up really nicely because exactly what I'm trying to expand out of this concept of elite capture that we get from social science is to try to tell the kind of longer term cultural political story about how it is that movements shift over time because of exactly the dynamics that you're picking up on. Right. So the social scientist starts with the idea of elite capture and thinks about it in the case of usually a kind of short time frame and a sort of objective quantifiable resource, right? How much of this land goes to the chieftains over here? Or how much of this cash grant ends up in the pockets of the wealthiest households in this region? But the insidious thing that happens over time, the kind of shift of movements from one set of, I think, more radical goals in the direction of kind of culturally simple ones. That version of elite capture is a story where the focal resource isn't this objective, how many dollars do people get, but is like, what is the agenda of this movement? What is it trying to achieve and how is it being received? What are its core demands? It's this more kind of inchoate political story. And I think being in the room privilege is, my kind of step towards understanding that longer term political process. And it is just more or less what it sounds like, right? If we're in these art museums, these prestigious art spaces, asking the general question, what does it look like to advance the cause of racial justice? It's tempting to give an answer that answers the questions on the terms of the few people of color that have made it into that space, right? Which might line up with people of color in general, but also might not. And I'm very sympathetic to this problem. In grad school, I was in a very parallel situation where I was the one Black graduate student in the room. And for the first few years of grad school, it was very important to me to expand a philosophical countercanon, thinking about the same kind of set of problems that I imagine artists and art students are thinking through, which is what counts as philosophy has been affected by this history of racial injustice that I'm generally interested in. So what does advancing racial justice look like in this space? Well, the kind of thing that would make it more hospitable to me and people like me. But over the years, I started asking myself some questions that were uncomfortable that I didn't have good answers to. If I was one of the hundreds of millions of Nigerians, that's where my folks are from. I'm Nigerian American. And the vast majority of them are facing much different problems. Would this be top of mind? Would this be the top priority? Would this be the most important thing to get out of this particular space?
Right.
That the three Nigerian American philosophers have people that look like them on their syllabus. I'm not sure that it would be. And so that kind of interrogation is something I think we all have to be willing to do. And the difficulty of doing it is the story of how elite capture reshapes the image of politics in these particular high prestige spaces.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about the image of politics. I mean, one reason I thought people might connect with your book, why I wanted to direct people to your book, is because recent art, like if you go to any art biennial museum show, it's just full of images of Black politics, work addressing the history of the Black political tradition or the anti-colonial political tradition. I mean, the most recent Whitney biennial, there was work just about Alain Locke in it. There was work about Suzanne Césaire, like literally kind of directing people to these traditions, these debates. In some cases, the radical Black political tradition. And at the same time, I think that's almost created some cynicism because this all happens within institutions that clearly have a certain kind of audience with a certain kind of background. The conversation of what this means seem to be very limited to historical questions. Not that history isn't a guide, but it just doesn't seem to have any links in the chain to anything really going on outside of these contexts. Use case studies from the history of struggle in a variety of places. I guess, what do you think the key political lessons are that get left out as these conversations about Black politics get captured? It feels like as they become simplified versions of themselves, there are like some things that kind of systematically vanish. And I feel like your book is trying to like reiterate what that is.
So a lot gets left out of the story when large, powerful institutions take on the names and iconography, especially of dead radicals. That is certainly true of the Black radical tradition. It's true of radical traditions quite generally, I think, of politics. And the thing that drops out of the picture, I think, most worryingly for me is the how story, right? So we get the pictures of the radical person. We get the Martin Luther King Day. We get the celebration of these actors, and in some cases, even their actions, though sometimes the actor is divorced from the things that they did. Mandela being perhaps the best case, right? But what we don't get is the story about what kinds of political connections and political movements were required to make those people succeed. So it's as though if you think the same thing as A. Philip Randolph, but you don't have the organized supporters behind you, that we're going to make the kind of progress that he was able to make by virtue of participating in the organized labor movement, being a leader in the organized labor movement, right? That's the thing that I'm most worried about dropping out of the picture, because the thing that asserts itself instead is the thing that I was kind of poking fun at just now in that description. The idea that if we apply the ideas, or maybe even just the aesthetic of taking these people seriously, to a power structure that is still controlled by the same people it was yesterday, and still has the balance of wealth and power that we had yesterday, that those ideas will do some kind of work, or that celebration of the right figures and right people and right diversity of people will do some kind of political redistributive work that you actually need fairly specific kinds of political interventions to accomplish. And so I think the story of struggle, and not just the story of the people who struggled, has to be what we remember and what we learn from all these histories and all these people.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me you have a particular focus on coalitions, coalitional thinking, the need to kind of like bring together mixed configurations of people with different identities, including across different levels of elite status. Danielle Jackson wrote a review of the Whitney Biennial this last year, not to pick on the same show. It was a very political show, but when she unpacked the wall labels, what she thought it was doing, it just felt very anti-coalitional. Like everybody was there to kind of like speak from their own position, and that often in ways that seemed like almost just negated the idea of politics that was about working together. And I think that kind of fits with the deference politics idea. It's like you go to an educational institution to kind of like learn the references you need to seem like you're a sensitive person, but not really to participate in things and to participate in political action. Do I get that right?
Yeah, and there's a moment in the Combahee River Collective where they kind of address this problem head on in a really nice way. And what they say is, we reject pedestals, queenhood and walking 10 paces behind. To be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. And what I take from that is we need to reject both deference politics, pedestals and queenhood. In that case, more a kind of patronizing politics, but I think there's a connection, right? But we need to reject that, the kind of overcorrection. And we also need to reject regular old misogyny and racism as we're experiencing in the male-dominated aspects of the racial justice movement and the white women-dominated aspects of the women's liberation movement. We need to reject both of these poles and do the thing it is when we're genuinely doing politics together. And that involves recognizing differences, but finding a way to move together levelly in a non-deferential, in a comradely way together. And that's what it is to genuinely do politics together.
Right. Last question, I think. I like your idea of elite capture. And there is recently a version of this that's percolated up into mainstream culture, that you read about in places like The Economist and The Atlantic, which look at the history of the social justice conversation of the last period and see it as just about a struggle between elites. There's this theory that's percolated that social justice is just about elite overproduction, that there are too many people competing for too many high prestige spaces, and that the language of cancellation and privileging a voice are just a tool in this kind of inter-elite struggle. And in some ways, this is a very convenient argument. It's like critique. You can have a righteous critique of some of the problems of identity politics that is also captured by elites. And this seems to me an example of that, or at least some of its articulations in these mainstream outlets. In some ways, it resonates with your theory. In some ways, it doesn't. So I just wondered, since we're in this moment where people are trying to navigate these things and try and figure out how to come together to defend the common good, but also to defend vulnerable people. And we've been left with all these problems, and there are all these competing crosstalk about what the problems really are. I wonder if you could comment on some of the way the critique of identity is getting taken up on the mainstream.
It is certainly true in the ways that we've been discussing, the discussions in academic philosophy or in art or in, the newsrooms of the fanciest publications, that there's certainly a version of thinking about social justice that is excessively responsive to the needs and demands of competition between the elites that inhabit those spaces. It is equally true that the critique of wokeness and social justice is also a tool of competition, politically speaking. And it's the version we might reflect that currently occupies the White House and related institutions. So if the idea is supposed to be that we're going to escape elite capture by noticing that wokeness has been captured by elites, we could raise the same problem for anti-wokeness. What we should do instead is reject the kind of elite-centric view of reality, right? Whatever true rational kernels might be in the kind of coverage of the excesses of social justice you might read in The Atlantic, there is a whole underexplored social reality underneath the same 7 articles about the same 10 universities. For every millionth article we read about the excesses happening at the Ivy League institutions, there is the underlying reality that 2/3 of the American public that goes to university does so at public schools. And many of the non-public schools that these other students go to are not, of course, the small fraction of students that go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or name your weirdly culturally influential small liberal arts college, right? There's just a lot of people and very few of them are having the particular version of the elite social justice conversation that's being lampooned, however rightly or wrongly, in these major publications. There is, after all, just the underlying social reality. Rather than asking the question of whether we think Harvard DEI has gone too far or not enough, we can just ask, how do we feel about misogyny? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Mm-hmm.
Like, at some point, you have to stop doing politics by association and figure out what the fuck it is that you stand for. And it's not informative that some of the people that use those words, patriarchy, misogyny, racism, et cetera, do so in ways that are less than perfect, at times that are less than opportune, and for reasons that are less than altruistic. You have to decide what you think about racism and what you are willing to do for justice on race or gender or religion or whatever else. And that isn't a question about what the elites are interested in. That isn't a question about what Harvard thinks racism is. That isn't a question even about what Trump thinks racism is. It's a question about what you think racism is. And it's a question about who you're willing to align with politically.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Femi, Táíwò, thank you for talking with me.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.